Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, long overdue. Let's continue it. Chapter 3, I'd recommend watching the previous 2 chapters, but that's up to you. Original link to the video, top of the description. Hit all the buttons. My name's Connor if you're new, and I like to learn about stuff. Let's go. If you're not ready to learn, there's the door. Home ec's down the hall. Make me a grilled cheese. Tomato. No, ketchup. Bacon.
Over the centuries, from 600 to 1200, the Turkic expansion created a vast Turkic cultural sphere of many a Turkic people. It stretched from Siberia to Anatolia, and as the Mongols emerged from the vast horde lands of the east, their conquest of Asia didn't just result in a mere subjugation of Turkic tribes and kingdoms, but in massive migration of Turkic peoples. From Central Asia to Persia and the Caucasus, many Turkic peoples packed and fled in search of refuge, and they mostly ended up in the lands of the Seljuks, thereby establishing a large Turkish population in Anatolia. The Seljuks themselves fell to the Mongols, and the 1300s were dominated by the Taifas, little petty kingdoms, warlords, and tribes that bickered and fought amongst themselves for control over the others and dominance. But they had a great advantage compared to the others defeated by the Mongols: the Zagros mountain range, stretching from the Caucasus to the Gulf. This vast range of mountains protects whoever rules Iran, but it also locks them into Iran, making it hard to sally forth into the Middle East or Anatolia. And at a certain point it was...
I just want to say, it doesn't really seem like the mountains really stop. It seems like all of Iran is a pretty mountainous country.
Simply no longer worthwhile to launch large expeditions to ensure the Anatolian Turks stayed in line. The most powerful of them was the Rum Sultanate, the successors to the Seljuk throne. One of the least powerful was a little state whose rulers originally came from Central Asia and had fled west from the Mongols: the Ottomans. While much of the Middle East had been flung into chaos through the Mongol invasion, the Ottomans managed to build a sphere of stability in their realm. This attracted craftsmen, intellectuals, and trade, while also providing the Ottomans with the stability required to go out and hassle others. Those others mainly being the Byzantines. But the Ottomans didn't just go charge into war as the Seljuks had. And of course they went through spats of conquest here and then, but the Ottomans mainly subdued the Byzantines through diplomacy, politics, and patience. They married Byzantine princesses, schemed within the politics of the Byzantine royal court, promised the Byzantines support against the Bulgars, Venetians, and Serbs, but used those promises to just take lands previously owned by the Byzantines, then conquered by others, and to not give them back. By the turn of the century, the Ottomans had established a firm grip over the Balkans and western Anatolia, and that gave them an enormous strategic advantage over the other caliphates and the Seljuks and everyone else who had come before them from the Middle East and Iran and attempted to conquer the Mediterranean. Access to an enormous established a firm grip over the Balkans and western Anatolia, and that gave them an enormous strategic advantage over the other caliphates and the Seljuks and everyone else who had come before them from the Middle East and Iran and attempted to conquer the Mediterranean. Access to the resources of these lands would further Ottoman conquest for more power elsewhere. It gave them a place...
So, question, I might sound like an idiot, but I don't care. I remember the Sassanids and Byzantines, and when learning about the spread of Islam videos, so in the 700s, I think, 600s, 700s, AD, and it might have been something they covered in the past 2 videos, but when did the Sassanids collapse?
Of some tranquility as the Mongol hordes invaded Anatolia again. But to understand the complete significance, we have to look at maps and ships. Seafaring was extremely dangerous for most of human history and mostly involved coast hopping. You would sail along the coastline, always in sight of said coastline, and at all costs avoid the open ocean as much as you possibly could. The means to navigate the vast open seas were simply not available, and getting lost out of sight of the coast was tantamount to a death sentence. This, of course, cancelled out most of the Atlantic as any means of transportation by sea, but transport by sea was still faster and more efficient than transport by land, so it was still worth the risk heading out and hopping along the coastline. The Mediterranean, however, was different. It was mostly calm, but far more important.
Sorry, do you guys think there must have been people who got lost at sea well before Age of Exploration, Columbus and Magellan, whatever, and there must have been people who got, shipwrecked or something, or they got lost at sea and ended up hitting, maybe crashing into South America or Central America, and then just ended up dying or being killed by natives or something. I just wonder if that happened. I'm guessing it did.
As any means of transportation by sea, but transport by sea was still faster and more efficient than transport by land, so it was still worth the risk heading out and hopping along the coastline. The Mediterranean, however, was different. It was mostly calm, but far more important, it had peninsulas, lots of peninsulas, all over the place. And when you look at these maps, it is also useful to forget the current geopolitical boundaries and borders. 1,000 years ago, the concept of Europe as a uniform entity of some shared culture or values would have made no sense. What, however, would have made sense would have been to categorize the region around the Mediterranean as its own entity, a kind of Mediterranean sphere of culture and influence. People in the Levant would have had more interactions with people in Sicily than people in Sicily would have had with people from the North Sea. Add to that the Egyptian breadbasket, and you have a region that many empires came to try and rule for themselves. Especially...
I feel like everyone around the Mediterranean have been very familiar with each other for thousands of years, and so it's no surprise to me that that's the case.
And you have a region that many empires came to try and rule for themselves, especially in these regions: the Adriatic, the Aegean, the Black Sea, and in particular the Dardanelles. In these waters, it is close to impossible to get lost at sea. Almost like lakes, no matter where you head, you will almost certainly at some point hit land in close vicinity. This means that you didn't need to hop along the coastline as much, and that you could tax, police, and control all traffic going through these segments of ocean. This allowed for specialization in nautical transport and warfare, and consequently it should not surprise you that prior to the 16th century, most European and Middle Eastern empires happened to be those who controlled those straits.
Okay, does anyone know how deep what is the Mediterranean's deepest point, I wonder?
This is a great springboard to go out and conquer the rest of the Mediterranean. And what about the Mediterranean? What makes it so special? It is again the fact that ocean travel was limited to coast hopping. To the people of the time, the oceans were vast, deep pits of certain death. Siberia was empty horde lands with close to no means of large-scale transportation. So if you owned the Eastern Mediterranean, you controlled all trade between west and east, be it the spices from India or silk from China. All of it had to go through the Eastern Mediterranean. And if you controlled that, you could tax it. Before the 17th century...
I love that. So I love how it's connecting to other things I know in history. Clearing fog of war. It's the most satisfying things about watching history videos. Is so that, like, the not being in control of the routes to Asia over land that have been used for centuries, if not millennia, causes the age of exploration. Am I oversimplifying? Am I right?
The geography of the Eastern Mediterranean was geography that made its owners superpowers. Then there's also the breadbasket, specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both these regions have the benefit of the most fertile lands in the region combined with a mild climate. This consistently produced the regular surplus in grain, which in return could feed vast empires, while most lands elsewhere had to consistently face regular famines due to crop failures and other agricultural disadvantages. Those who owned Egypt could guarantee a regular, not just supply, but a surplus of food for its own population, allowing them to focus their attention elsewhere and expand. As much as we like to think of the Ottomans as a historical entity that represents an Islamic force trying to conquer Europe, the reality of the matter is that the Ottomans mainly pursued rule over the Mediterranean, because most powers before them had done so as well, and because of the enormous geopolitical value of the Mediterranean before the 1700s. And the first step to controlling the Mediterranean was completed by the 1450s, when And the first step to controlling the Mediterranean was completed by the 1450s, when the Ottomans ended the Byzantines and controlled most of the Balkans, Marmara, the Bosporus, and the Aegean coastline. The Ottomans made Constantinople their new capital and transformed the city dramatically. Under the Byzantines, the city had stretched along the southern end of the Golden Horn. Under the Ottomans, over the next 2 centuries, the city expanded into all directions to include the entire Golden Horn and both sides of the Bosporan Straits. The massive city would come to dominate international trade for the next 200 years, and also would be the harbor from which an enormous Ottoman fleet would try to conquer and control the Mediterranean. Beginning what we now know as the era of transformation.
When do they get into conflicts? Like, I hear all these, the wars between Russia and the Turks, and when do they get beef, Russia and Turkey, or the Turks and Russia?
That massive navy helped conquer the Black Sea coastline and Crimea, as well as solidify Ottoman control over Greece. Meanwhile, in the south, Egypt and the Levant had been ruled by the Mamelukes, an incompetent series of squabbling dynasties that were unable to put up much resistance to an Ottoman conquest of their lands, which then pushed further to conquer North Africa, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, from where the last of the Abbasid caliphs was dragged to Istanbul to abdicate the title of caliph to the Ottoman Sultan. With that done, they were now the center of the Islamic world. They controlled and taxed all Silk Road trade to Europe, had the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and they had access to the Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control. But there's something important which we might be missing.
Ever since I watched History of the Entire World, I guess, and he said onion hat or whatever. I can't stop thinking of onion now when I look at the hat.
Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control. But there's something important which we might be missing here.
Hold on.
Trade to were now the center of the Islamic world. They controlled and taxed all Silk Road trade to Europe, had the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and they had access to the Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control. But there's something important which we might be missing here. People tend to live in a society. We can look at maps and economics as much as we want, but fundamentally an empire or nation-state construct of any sort is always a society, and without a coherent social fabric holding it all together, society and economics as much as we want, but fundamentally an empire or nation-state construct of any sort is always a society, and without a coherent social fabric holding it all together, societies tend to collapse into themselves. So what was this Ottoman society like? And how did the social fabric of this society keep such a large and diverse empire together for 400 years? The reason is because at the time, it was one of the few empires that actually had a social structure that could sustain an empire. It tolerated differences. It is easy to forget that before the 1900s, Anatolia's population was 1/3 non-Muslim. In general, there were times at which this Islamic caliphate had a larger Christian population than the Muslim population. On average, Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire were wealthier than the average Turks, because the Greeks had built a large network of trade over centuries that the Ottomans didn't just take from them, but just taxed. Armenian craftsmen helped build the Ottoman navy and their new expanded capital, Istanbul. And the reason for this is because under the Islamic laws, which were the laws of the empire, all these groups were tolerated. We also have to keep in mind that in that time, group identities barely ever exceeded across the borders and limitations of the village that a person resided in. A concept such as a nationalistic tribal identity built on grounds of language or ethnicity wasn't prevalent. And people to an empire are first and foremost one thing, a resource, probably the most valuable resource there is. And the Ottomans were one of the...
That was one of the biggest things that I had to shake out of my head in this learning process about history is I was always so confused about all of the mercenaries from different places fighting against their own people or seemingly... And I guess I was stuck in this worldview of just, these are established countries and they fight one another and this happens, and through the mercenaries and what he just said, learning that nationalism, I guess, is a pretty new concept.
The few empires of the time who understood that and welcomed that resource wherever they could receive it. When Spain expelled its Jews, it was the Ottomans who jumped in to welcome them. And that tolerance that made life in a religious hierarchy possible gave the Ottomans enormous advantages over their contemporaries. Arab caliphates, in comparison, tended to overly stigmatize non-Muslim groups, enforced Arab tribal structures over subjects, and were regularly subjected to anti-Jewish programs and expulsions. Europe was at that time consumed by religious hatred. If you were Catholic, living in Protestant lands was not a...
I saw this same one in the Sabaton video, Lifetime of War, this same photo. Jesus. The more you look, the more you look around in the photo, the more horrifying it is. So
good idea. Neither was the reverse. The resulting conflicts bogged Europe down into massive bloodlettings such as the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War that stifled innovation and expansion. While within the Ottoman Empire, differing religious groups were tolerated, and this gave the Ottomans an enormous benefit in building and sustaining internal stability, but to also take advantage of external conflict. When the Ottomans, for example, marched on Vienna, they were joined and supported by Hungarian Protestants who
until the Wind Hussars
no longer wished to live under Austrian Catholic Habsburg rule. On a side note, there's an Austrian racial slur for Hungarians that Catholic and supported by Hungarian Protestants who no longer wish to live under Austrian Catholic Habsburg rule. On a side note, there's an Austrian racial slur for Hungarians that developed out of this historic event, Kurzi-Türken, which means cross-carrying Turks. But it would be unwise, as many unfortunately do today, to see this as a glorified, tolerant Islamic past. For one, and probably most importantly, there's a big difference between being tolerated and having rights as a person. The main difference being that one of them is a long list of guarantees to you as a person for your safety, life and well-being. The other is a list of all the things you cannot do, mostly dictated by a majority to an oppressed minority. The tolerance under the Ottomans from our modern lens was preferable to the intolerance of its neighbors, but it was just that, a condescending tolerance. Under Sharia law, a non-Muslim is a lesser being. A non-Muslim pays special taxes, has no access to legal protections that Muslims may have. His testimony against a Muslim will always be rejected in courts, which by extension means Muslims have a free hand to commit crimes against non-Muslims without facing any consequences.
That's crazy. So not even like a bias, it's just no say. Like you could murder a Christian and just say I didn't do it, and the family member and just be like, nope, doesn't count.
Non-Muslims are forbidden from owning a means of transportation, are forbidden from building new houses.
I understand this is in. I'm not like judging the Ottoman Empire here. They're allowing a lot more than other European and different nations are allowing in terms of religious freedom. I'm just pointing it out.
Of worship were forbidden from publicly practicing their faith and lived in segregated ghettos. From our modern lens, this is unacceptable, but even this discriminatory standard of living was preferable over the chaos and madness of Europe at the time, where worshipping the wrong god simply got you burned alive. If you were to travel back through time into the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, calling the first official you encountered a Turk or even an Ottoman would have earned you a weird look and the response, "You are in the Roman Empire," as that is what the empire saw itself as. After taking Constantinople, they proclaimed themselves to be the legitimate heirs of the Roman Empire. This was also a society of multiple languages, from Turkish to Persian to Arabic to Armenian, Greek and Hebrew. And languages were also separated by class, not only within...
It's crazy how Rome is the empire, it seems the only one that was revered so much and so many people wanted to be like them. It seems like after Rome fell, everyone's just trying to capital Constantinople or Rome and just be like, oh, I'm Rome now. Oh, I'm Rome. Over here, I'm Roman.
In the Islamic religious hierarchy, but by social status. Few people outside of the Ottoman Arab lands spoke Arabic. The language was reserved to be the language of religion and the mosque. The commoners spoke Turkish, but the Sultan, the royal family, and the royal court all spoke Persian, as they had held on to the court traditions and practices of the Seljuks, and also saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of Iran. Which leads us to another often overlooked fact. We like to often think of the Ottomans as the great rivals of Russia or the Habsburgs, but the reality is that they mostly fought their wars with dynasties ruling Iran, as they wished to incorporate Iran into their empire. The Ottoman transformation period lasted for 2 centuries, throughout which it was at the height of its reach and the predominant power of the hemisphere. But as we all know, that empire came to gradually, over the course of its remaining 2 centuries, to collapse into itself.
Good chapter. Don't worry, I'm not gonna wait a month like I did, or a week like I did last time. I will continue this over the next few days. All right, don't worry. Awesome. Yeah, I have nothing to say. I learned a lot there, and I'm really curious as to when Russian, Turkish, drama started, I guess. Yeah, looking forward to it. See you guys next time.